And then as we have people that come in, we can just reiterate some things and then go from there. But basically, the goal tonight is just to walk through a bunch of things with Watchman Sentinel, like we've done with other workshops. Sorren and I are going to be walking through this stuff tonight, so we kind of split up some of the different topics as we go through. The disclaimer we'll always throw out there is we're just two schmucks playing this game that love the class. So where we're coming from is having done research on this, playing it for a while, and then a lot of theory crafting too. So don't take everything we say as gospel. Always play around and see what's going to work for you. There are some things that are kind of like more or less set in stone because they'll get the most bang for your buck with different things, and we'll talk about some of those. But we'll go ahead and get started. So if you have questions, throw them out. Nothing is off the wall. We'll make sure we go through anything that people have questions on because Sentinel is definitely one of those underplayed classes in our guild, at least. I think we see one very rarely out there in the wild. So the more comfortable people get with it, the better. So to just start us off, why do we play Sentinels? Yeah. Well, we have to play Sentinels to piss off Zer, and we have to do no bones while playing Sentinels to continue that tradition. They also do a nice chunk of damage and are very useful in operations especially. We'll talk about some of the specific abilities, but just the utility alone from Sentinels makes them very, very useful. So first thing we'll just jump into is a couple of quick things we can get out of the way about stat goals and gearing. So gearing for a Sentinel is pretty straightforward. Something like a set bonus, the quick answer, Descent of the Fearless. For Watchman Sentinel, it's just the best all-around set. So if you're looking for something to work towards, get those pieces. And like with any class that has a set, you want to make sure you've got the 6-piece of that set and then 1 piece of Amplified Champion. Descent of the Fearless it's just a good blanket boost to your damage because whenever you use Force Clarity, which we'll talk about a little bit then too, or just gain a charge of it, you have 10% damage. And you gain it so often, you're basically having a constant 10% damage boost to every one of your abilities. It's just all around good. So as far as tacticals, so I'm going to link the one that is basically used all the time. So if you don't have Spiteful Saber, I would get Spiteful Saber. It's just too darn useful. There is one for AoEs called Malmoral Mask, which I'll link in a second. But Spiteful Saber, if you read the description, Slash, Dispatch, and Twin Saber Throw refresh duration of Cauterize, which is a key burn ability that we have, and tickets damage. So it really stacks up really nicely with your rotation too. So every time you hit one of those abilities on a target, or in Saber Throw's case, multiple targets, it's going to both refresh it and ticket the damage. So over the course of a boss fight, for instance, that's a lot of extra damage. It also means that as we talk about rotations, you tend to spam something like Slash to be getting that refresh and burn constantly. The nice thing there is you basically apply Cauterize on your target, and you don't have to ever click that button again unless it falls off for some reason, which hopefully it doesn't. Unless you're moving around. Malmoral Mask is good for AoE damage. It's helpful when you have large groups of ads. The thing about that one, though, if you read through the description, it's on Mirthless Lash, which it has a pretty hefty cooldown, even with some of the abilities that are out there. So you have to hit a target that has Force Melt on it. But the burst damage that it does is actually pretty substantial, and it's 8 targets around there. So it does a nice chunk of damage. So if you want to just pop between the two, depending on single target or trash fights, you can try it out. I know, Sorren, feel free to chime in on this one too, but I've never used Malmoral Mask all that often. I think Spiteful Saber just has a lot of bang for your buck because when you spread Cauterize with something like Force Sweep and then just hits Twin Saber Throw, it's just a crazy duration for Cauterize and all sorts of good damage there too.
Yeah, I will say that I don't even have Malmoral Mask. Like Brian said, you can dot spread and Twin Saber Throw and keep your Cauterize up on everybody, and that's all the damage you really need. You don't really. A lot of this spec is going to come from your dot damage because it is a dot spec, so you don't really have to rely on those other abilities as much. Of course, they do. We'll talk about that later, but they do, especially Mirthless Lash, give a lot of extra damage, but the key amounts of damage from this spec are coming from those dots. And so having those up as long as possible and spreading those and keeping those up on other targets, that's where your main meat of this spec's damage is going to come from.
That's a great question there too. I'll be there. It's No Time for Fools. I have never used it. I've tried it just to see how it works. It's not bad for things like heroics or dailies or something like that, but the kicker with that one is you basically have to, it only works if you kill a target below 30% health. And if you hit a target at 31% health, it doesn't reset it. So it takes a lot of timing, which for trash fights, I don't even bother with that type of timing. So really, it's a niche one, and it's hard to find a good use for it because of that requirement. If it was below half health, maybe. But right now, it's still kind of one of those, ones. There is another one out there called Thirsty Blade, which another situational, another troll tactical too. This one basically increases the blade barrage damage up to 25% per bleed tick. Okay, all well and good, but basically blade barrage has a cooldown of roughly 17 seconds when you have some alacrity. So that's a long duration, and if you don't time it right, you won't get the full 25%. So again, same thing where it's just too niche, too specific need. You get more bang for your buck from Spiteful Saber. Now, in terms of amplifiers, Sorren and I were talking about this there too. The kind of go-to, if you just want to focus on one, is periodic intensity, because so much of your damage comes from dots. That being said, I know Sorren does, is run 7 periodic intensities and then 2 weapon expertise, because while your dots do most of your damage, you do have other abilities that are more weapon damage, like Mirthless Lash, Blade Barrage, and of course Slash, which you'll be spamming. So you can basically bounce around, but 7 and 2 is kind of the recommend. So 7 of the periodic intensities and 2 weapon expertise, which is of course on both your weapons and all 7 gear pieces. And for your amplified champion piece, either of those work just fine. Things like you want to avoid oral command AoE damage. That sounds good, but you get more bang for your buck from these. Stat-wise, as we kind of slip into that, it is very, very similar to a lot of the DPS specs. You want to aim for your 110% accuracy on your melee. That's just the golden standard there. For this particular spec, you want to have at least the 12-13 alacrity. It's worthless to go all the way up to the 1.3 global cooldown. It is what it is. So once you get those 2 breakpoints, we've got the accuracy and the 12-13 alacrity, dump everything else in crit. And like all other DPS specs, the 2 relics that you want really are for under 75 stuff. So basically everything but Duxon and Meridian. You want the Devastating Vengeance relic, and of course the Primeval Feet Sealer Click You. Otherwise, you can play around with stats however you see fit. For instance, with mine, I don't use any accuracy augments because I'm kind of lazy like that. So I've got my accuracy at 1637, which is a little bit higher than the exact number, but that's just fine for me. Questions so far?
Do you get your accuracy from, what do you do? Basically 3 enhancements then? Or, sorry, 4?
Yeah, 4. Exactly that. And I've got some of the enhancements that have less than 431, which give me like more power or something like that, rather than having.
And just in case you don't want to do it that way, the way I have it is 3 enhancements and a accurate. Let's see. Sorry, 2 enhancements, a left side piece, and then an augment, an accuracy augment. So that's what I do. Mine's 1621. So it's about the same as Brian's. You can get about the same thing either way.
You just want to play around and see, as long as you get relatively close, just not under.
But yeah, my percentage, just so you know, is 110.15. So it's just barely above.
I mean, if you're at 111, yeah, it's too much. But so it goes back to, for mine, again, I am lazy. So many of my characters have biochem. I didn't feel like making a whole bunch of new accuracy ones, so I still have the versatile stim, which I know for 70 stuff is worthless. But yeah, proficient's the best one to go for if you can, because that gives you accuracy and crit. Okay. Well, I'm going to talk about utilities. It's always the number one question that's out there, too, is what should you take? Toss it your way, Sorren. And always disclaimer here, too, like we said, these are some of the recommended ones that we'll talk through, some that are suggestions that maybe Sorren likes, some that I like, and then as you all talk through things, which ones you tend to take. But we're going to outline a couple that are pretty much just key you really want to.
Yeah, so for utility points, in the skillful tree at the top, there's really not any that you want to run besides the 3 that I'm going to talk about. I'll talk about one other one that you can maybe find some use for. But first one, Jedi Enforcer. This is going to increase your damage dealt by rebuke. This is a key defensive cooldown you have, and the duration is increased by 4 seconds. That's really helpful. Like I said, it's one of your key defensive abilities. So you're going to be using this a lot, and it just gives you some extra damage and some extra defense for a little bit longer. The next one is right below it. It's Stoic. This is going to increase your damage reduction. This is always helpful on anybody. Having extra damage reduction is just really nice. Also, you build 2 centering when attacked. So this is going to help you in any case that, you get hit by an ad. Maybe you pull off for a second on the boss, something like that. This is just going to get you a little bit extra centering. We'll talk about what that is in just a little bit. It can occur for every 1.5 seconds. So, you're not going to get a crazy amount of centering from this, but it's still pretty quick and you'll get a good bit from it. The last one is the bottom right. It is defensive roll. This is going to reduce damage taken from area effects by 30%, which is huge. And that's also going to be super helpful for raiding and even flashpoints and heroics, things like that, where a lot of ads and bosses have big AoE hits. They do lots of damage. That's just really helpful. And your internal elemental damage reduction is also increased by 3 seconds. That's also really helpful. Like I said, damage reduction is always going to be helpful, especially on a class like Sentinel. Sentinel is very squishy. You have a lot of defensive cooldowns to kind of compensate for that. We'll get into those a little bit later, but it's always helpful to have that stuff. The only other thing you can maybe run if you kind of like running a lot of heroics, a lot of flashpoints, stuff like that, and you're taking you're jumping in, you're taking a lot of damage, you can run Jedi Crusader, which is the one right next to Stoic. This is just going to generate some focus for you when you get attacked while your rebuke is active. So the Jedi Enforcer and Jedi Crusader kind of work hand in hand in that way. You're going to get some extra damage from it. It's going to last a little bit longer, and you can generate some focus from it, even though, it can occur for every 2 seconds. But you can still get some focus from that if you want to. But that's really only going to be used for, like I said, any ad fights, things like that. The rest of them, not really that great. The Adamant one that's right above Jedi Crusader, don't really want to use this. The other ones are just kind of better. You can use it if you are doing heroics things, getting stunned a lot. That might help you generate some focus, but you don't really need it in a general sense for the class. Trailblazer, it's pretty garbage for this spec. You really just don't use Cyclone Slash, so it's just not really necessary. Blade Barrage, immobilizing the target. You don't need that unless you want to use it for PvP, but that is not a thing that you're going to run for really anything else. And then the last one is just the movement speed slow. Same thing. It's kind of a PvP thing. Masterful, moving to this one has a few more that you can kind of opt into based off what you like. So the first one that I run, and Brian kind of talked me into one of these, Ardor is one that you want to have. This is going to be the third one from the left in the top row. Transcendence no longer consumes your centering, which is really helpful, but it goes on a cooldown for 30 seconds. If you don't have this, you have to get your full centering stacks of 30 and then use it, but you don't really want to be using your centering on your Transcendence. You want to be using that on your Zen or your Raid buff. So this is just really helpful to get that kind of taken care of, where you can use Transcendence no matter what, as long as it's off cooldown. The next one I use is Expunging Camouflage, which is the second one from the left on the bottom row. This is Force Camouflage is going to remove all cleansable effects when activated. This is really helpful for cleansing yourself of dots, anything in a raid, flashpoint, something that's going to put a very heavy dot on you. This is really helpful to get that off, clear it off of yourself. You don't have to rely on a healer to do that for you. It also helps your healers out, so they don't have to try and cleanse everybody. The last one that I've swapped to now, after talking to Brian, is the Jedi Promulgator, however you say that. It's the last one from the left on the bottom row, and it is a cooldown reduction for your rebuke. So when you use Strike, Zealous Strike, or Leg Slash, but you're not going to use Leg Slash for the most part, but the other two abilities you will be using quite often, and that's going to reduce your rebuke, which also kind of plays into your Jedi Enforcer that you took in the first row. So both of those kind of play together, and you can keep your rebuke up pretty often. The other ones that you can use that are pretty good, and kind of, like I said, up to you and what you like better, is Enduring, the one right next to the Jedi Promulgator, which is the one that I used to use. It increases the duration of Guarded by the Force by 2 seconds and reduces its cooldown by 30 seconds, which is pretty big because it has quite a long cooldown. And it's going to make it 6 seconds versus 4, and it cuts the cooldown down by quite a good bit. The only other one in this row that really makes a whole lot of sense to use is maybe Watchguard. You can use this for heroics, flashpoints. You don't want to use this in a raid because it's not going to affect the boss, because your pacify won't affect the boss. But you can do this for heroics, flashpoints, things like that, where you can use your pacify. And we'll talk about what pacify does in a little bit, but that's a cool ability you can use. It just doesn't apply to all bosses and things. Also, it's going to reduce the cooldown of your interrupt, which is always really helpful. Having your interrupt reduced by 2 seconds is pretty helpful. And you can use your rebuke while you're stunned, which, make of that what you will. Force Fade is okay. Gives you some increased movement speed and a speed bonus when you use your Force Camouflage, and increases the duration of your Force Camouflage. This one also is helpful, and I'll talk about the heroic one that kind of ties into this a little bit if you like using it, but that's another one that's kind of okay. Pulse is not really that helpful. You're not going to be using Force Stasis that often on a Sentinel, just because the only time you're really going to be using that is heroics, flashpoints, and maybe if you need to CC something in an op, but it's going to be an ad, something like that, and you don't really need it to reduce the cooldown. It's not very long anyway. And the Reigning Reach, just don't even look at that one. It doesn't really exist. This pertains to your Leg Slash, and it's not an ability you're going to use very much unless you're a PvPer. If you like PvP, you could try this out. It's going to give some bonuses to your Leg Slash, but yeah, I would advise against it. Moving into the heroics, the first one that you most definitely want to have is Fleet-Footed. This is the first one in the top row, coming from the left side. What this does is it makes your Transcendence purge movement impairing effects, and it also gives you an increased movement speed. This is really, really helpful. Please run this anytime you're on a Sentinel. It's just really helpful. The increased movement speed is super helpful, and it also purges those movement impairing effects for you. It's just great. It's a great talent to have. Now, there's a lot in the heroics that you can run with, so I'm going to talk about the ones that I run, and then we'll talk about some of the other ones as well. Inspired Focus, the one right below the Fleet-Footed, is another one that I run. So when you pop your raid buff, you're going to generate 12 focus, which is the max you can have, and you're going to heal for 1% of your maximum health. Don't really care about the maximum health part, but it's helpful. But really, what you want from this is that 12 focus. Like getting an entire focus bar is just really helpful when you pop your raid buff. The next one that I use is Hidden Advance, so it is the third from the left on the bottom row. What this does is when you activate your Force Camouflage, you gain a charge of Hidden Advance. every half second. And this is going to stack up to 4% over the time. And then that's going to apply to your next melee attack. So this is really helpful for raiding, especially because you're going to be using your Force Camouflage a lot. And we'll talk about why in a little bit, but you're going to be using it quite a bit. The other ones that you can use, I believe, Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, but Brian, I think, uses Intercessor, which is the bottom right.
Love it.
And this just gives your Force Leap an additional charge. So this is kind of helpful because you don't get the Guardian talent where you can refresh your cooldown after you kill something. So this helps you, kind of jump around in fights a little bit more. And let's see. I know Brian also likes the Contemplation, which is the second from the left on the top row. And this one, you don't care about the cooldown reduction on your awe that much, but the thing is you can build your centering over the course of your introspection. So that's your regening ability that you can use. So you can build this up before you even go into a fight and immediately go in being able to use your Zen ability. So that's really helpful. I don't personally use that one, but I know Brian likes that one. And Cut Loose is okay. This one's helpful for if you have a lot of movement impairing effects in a specific fight or anything like that. This helps your blade blitz be a little bit more effective. Zealous Ward, it's okay. You can use this if you're kind of like tanking anything for if you're going in heroics and things, you could use this just to kind of help yourself from getting CC'd for 6 seconds when you pop your Saber Ward, and it heals you some, so that's nice as well. Zealous Judgment, this one is kind of okay. It kind of depends on what you're doing. This could be really good for Flash Once and Heroics again, because your Dispatch, which is an ability it's an execute ability, but what you can do is use your Pacify, and that will let you use your Dispatch at any point, no matter the health, and it also reduces the amount of damage you take by force and tech attack. So that's helpful for Heroics and things, but once again, you can't use your Pacify on raid bosses. So that's not exactly gonna be very helpful in that situation. So yeah, any questions about any of those that I didn't see?
I have a question. I'm going to ask it.
Go for it.
Didn't at some point the Sentinel's use of Force Leap was you could jump when you're really close to something? Did they take that out of the game? Like you didn't have to be within 10 meters. You could be closer. Correct?
Yeah.
On Watchman?
It's been removed. Force Melt is now the new up close type of thing. So you used to use Force Leap to gain more force. But now that's Force Melt.
Okay. Well, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about some of the discipline path utility points that you're going to get that are really important. I'm not going to go over all of them because it'll take a little bit. And I'll talk about some of the key abilities along with that kind of go hand in hand with these. So first one is going to be the very first one you get after Force Melt. It is called Burning Sweep. So what this is going to do is it reduces the cooldown of your Force Sweep, which is really helpful, and reduces the focus it consumes. Also, the big point here is that it's going to deal more damage, and it's going to spread your dots. So your Cauterize, your Force Melt, you can jump in, you can apply your dots, and then you can Force Sweep. And what this is going to do is it's going to put all your dots on anybody, on the people that you hit. So this is really helpful. It's really important for ad fights, or if a boss summons ads, anything like that. You want to be dot spreading. This is going to really help, pump that damage up. The next one, Force Melt, you don't really care about that one. So increases the critical strike chance of your burn effects. The Searing Saber, that one is pretty helpful. It's giving you an increased crit chance on your, or increased crit damage on your burn effects. The next really important one is going to be your Gio Form. This is, so each specific spec in in Sentinel has a different form. What this one does is it makes your melee attacks increase damage dealt by 1% for 30 seconds, stacks up to 5 times. So that is really, really helpful. That's kind of part of the bread and butter of this class, and you want to be utilizing that to your advantage, making sure that you get your Gio Form stacked to get that increased damage. Merciless Zeal, your dots are going to heal you. It's pretty nice. The next one that is really helpful is Plasma Blades. Your burn effects have a 20% chance to build 1 focus when they deal damage. That's just going to help you a lot with keeping your focus up and making sure, as long as you have your dots on, you're going to be kind of rewarded for that. Making sure you keep those on. So GR Mastery is the next one. Your burn effects are 1% more likely to critically hit per stack of Gio Form. So this is another incentive to have your Gio stacked up. So that way you have that 5% increased crit chance on your dots. And also it's going to modify your Zen ability. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about that since it's here, what this is going to change your Zen to do. So in others, each spec also has a different Zen, like what Zen does when you use it. And for Watchman, it's going to increase the critical chance of your burn attacks by 100% and causing the burn damage you deal to heal your group for 1% of max health. And it gets 6 charges. So you want to make sure you have your dots on, and then you can use this, and it's going to give your dots a crit, and you're also going to get some healing for the group. That's just really helpful. So you want to be using this every single time you have 30 stacks of centering. You want to be using this unless you're popping your raid buff. That's the only other time that you're gonna swap out the centering for that versus your Zen. An ability that is also really helpful that you want to be utilizing is Fowler's Call. Now, what this ability does, it's the green ability where they got the little saber over their head. You're going to immediately build 30 stacks of centering. You want to be using this. It has a long cooldown, 2.5 minutes, but you want to be using this. If you're going to pop your raid buff, you know that. You can immediately pop your Valorous Call afterwards and then pop your Zen. So that kind of compensates for that as well. Especially in raid fights, you want to be using this as much as possible on cooldown to try and keep your Zen up as often as you can. The next thing, trying to remember these as I. So yes, Mind Seer is another really key one. Your burning effects have 20% chance to grant Mind Seer, which increases the damage of your next Twin Saber throw by 100%. It can only occur every 18 seconds, but anytime you get this, you want to be using your Twin Saber throw. It's a very key ability in this spec because of that. Blazing Ward is really good just to know. Dealing burn damage to a target increases your damage reduction by 5% for 3 seconds, so you can kind of keep that up and have some damage reduction going for you. So next one is Accelerating Victory, Gio Form and Merciless Lash, I believe. Doesn't actually say that. Build 2 stacks at a time. In addition, Merciless Lash has a 50% chance to build Accelerating Victory when activated, increasing the damage your next slash or dispatch deal by 5% per stack. You can stack twice. So it's really good to stack this up, and then you can use your slash or your dispatch, and it's just going to give you an extra 10% damage on that. So that's also really helpful. And yeah, last one is Smoldering Burns. Merciless Lash increases the burn damage you deal by 3% for 4.5 seconds after you use it. So this is really helpful to just increase your dot damage, and you want to be using Merciless Lash on cooldown anyway. So this is really good to just give you some extra dot damage. Anybody have any questions about any other discipline path points that you see that you think are important, don't care about? Any questions about anything?
I'll just echo to the one thing is, as you have a chance, just read through all of them yourself and just make sure you're familiar with these things, because this tends to the knowledge of what these different discipline things, passives do, will make you a much better DPS, not only on Watchman Sentinel, but just for any class, rather. Because they really do make or break the specs.
Sorry I'm late.
Oh, you're fine. I know trying to record too, so we'll have a video out of this too.
I just had to do some household. I had to do some household chores. For example, grocery shopping.
Okay, so no questions. What I'll do real quick is just kind of cover some key abilities, and then we're going to rotate into Brian talking about some the priority kind of rotation system that you're going to be going through. But just want to talk about a couple key abilities. One that I already kind of talked about a lot was your Force Camouflage. One reason why you want to be using this on cooldown is it is your threat drop. So this is what you're going to be using to decrease your threat and make sure that the tanks don't have a difficult time keeping threat of the boss. You can do a lot of damage in this spec, and you don't want to be that person that's pulling off the boss, getting the whole group killed. So make sure you're using that. It also plays into some of those utility points that we talked about with the cleanse and the damage buff that you can get if you decide to run that one. So defensive abilities, I'm just going to run over those real quick. You have Rebuke. Like I said, this is your bread and butter one. Saber Ward that both the Guardian and the Sentinel get. And then Guarded by the Force, this is your 3-minute cooldown. It's very long, but it gives you damage reduction by 90%. You reduce all damage by 99% for 4 seconds. So it's pretty huge. And you want to pop that anytime you get in a dire situation. Inspiration, this is your, it's the creepy lady face. This is your raid buff, and it is very vital that you use this a lot in op fights. You want to make sure you use this. It's probably debatably the best one out of all the raid buffs in the game. It gives you just a straight up 10% damage and healing done by 10%. You just get an increased damage and healing buff. So it's very important that you want to use that and make use of that in the fights. Another one, so like I said, Brian's going to go about the rotation and stuff. So I'm just going to kind of cover the abilities. I didn't go through them in the tree, but the big abilities are your dots. So Overload Saber, this is going to put energy on your lightsabers. Next 3 successful melee attacks are going to do a dot. Then you have Force Melt, Cauterize. Those are your dots. So those are the 3 dots you're going to be using. You want to keep up at all times. You want to make sure those are on as much as possible. Because like I said before, that's where your bread and butter damage is going to come from. Mirthless Lash is one of your next key abilities. You want to be using this on cooldown. It does a lot of damage, and it grants you the Merciless passive, so it lowers the cooldown of your next Merciless Lash by 1.5 seconds, and that can stack up to 3 times. So if you're using this on cooldown, it cuts that cuts the cooldown of your Merciless Slash down by 4.5 seconds, which puts it down to about 9.4-ish seconds if your alacrity is about the same as mine. So you're going to have about 9.4 seconds versus 13.9. The next thing is Transcendence. We talked about that. Want to be using this a lot anytime you need to move, anything like that. Twin Saber Throw with that specific discipline path. You want to be using this a lot as well, and you can use it to keep your Cauterize up with Spiteful Saber, so this is really helpful as well. Zealous Strike, this is going to be your bread and butter focus builder. You're going to use this just to generate some focus early on in the fights and throughout the fight. And really, you have Blade Barrage as well, Blade Storm as well. These are some key abilities that you have in both the Guardian and Sentinel. Dispatch is, like I said, this is your execute ability. You're going to use this anytime they're below 30% HP, unless you run that the Pacify utility point. Force Clarity, that's the new ability. This is playing hand in hand with your Descent of the Fearless gear that we talked about. You want to be popping this every time it's available. You want to prioritize using it on your Merciless Slash, or your dispatch. Those are really the two big hitters that you have that are your big melee weapons. Merciless Lash comes priority. You want to be using it on that for sure. Other than that, if you don't have it up, things like that, you can use it on your slash, your dispatch, your twin saber throw. Those are some other good ones you can use it on. Force kick, that's your interrupt. You want to be making sure you use that as well anytime you can. And I don't think I'm missing any really key abilities. You got some other ones going on for you with Leg Slash. This is just a slow, reduces healing they take. Cyclone Slash is just kind of an AoE hit. You don't really use those too much. Another one you're not really going to use a lot is just your Strike. This is kind of just your basic ability that you start off with. It generates some focus if you need it, but especially if you're running that inspiration utility that I run, you really don't have a whole lot of problems with focus generation, especially because if you're that discipline that I talked about with your dots, also your Force Melt generates some focus as well. So it's going to generate 4 focus for you. It says 3, but you have that discipline path that gives you an additional 1. So you get 4 from that, plus the 6 on your Zealous Strike. The Zealous Strike's not a super long cooldown, and you get some focus from your burns as well. So you don't really have a whole lot of problems with focus generation. But if you do need to use it, you can. That'll generate you some focus as well. I think that's about it. You have Awe as well. Awe is just, a CC ability. And you have your Force Stasis, another CC ability. And then your Blade Blitz. That's about it. I did talk about Zen a little bit, but like I said, I'm just going to reiterate, you do want to be using with this spec, especially, really with any spec, but with this spec especially, you want to be using that on cooldown to just get maximum usage out of that extra crit chance on your burns. But I think that's about it. Anybody have any questions about abilities, when you might use something, when you won't, anything like that?
All right, let's put this to use. So this Watchman Sentinel does not have a rotation per se. It's just a priority rotation. So there are certain abilities you pretty much just want to use on cooldown. Others are more situational, like Sorren was talking about, but we're going to just walk through what you generally want to do. So there is kind of an opener, and then it goes more priority. So depending on whether or not you've taken the utility Contemplation, you could start off a fight with the full 30 stacks of centering. In which case you pretty much just pop Zen right away, so you get that extra crazy amount of damage at the start with all of your crit or with all your burns critting. That's one option. But if you don't, you can always just jump into a fight. So your Force Leap, when you jump in, it's going to give you 3 focus. Sure, good stuff. But right away, you're going to want to start using things like Force Melt, which again puts a dot on the target plus gives you some force. And then on cooldown, make sure you're hitting Overload Saber so that whenever you use a melee ability and you got one of those stacks, it's applying a burn stack. Because we're using Spiteful Saber Tactical, the Cauterize dot, you hit that once on a single target, and hopefully you'll never have to hit that again. The only time you ever want to is if it happens to fall off, if you're moving around or avoiding some crazy AoE damage or whatever it might be. But that's pretty much what you apply right away. And then as soon as possible, you want to hit your first Merciless Slash so you start getting that cooldown reduced. So, like for example, I'm going to jump in here. I'm going to pop Overload Saber, get ready right away. Maybe a Force Melt and a Cauterize. I'll pop maybe a Zealous Strike to get me some more focus, depends on where you're at. You want to use your Merciless Slash right away just to be able to start those stacks up. It lasts for 30 seconds, so you've got a good chunk of time to get the next one in to keep lowering it. But with your Cauterize, this is where you kind of have some choice. So it lasts for right around 8 or 9 seconds on a target. And we talked about the fact that Slash will reset it and tick it. So if nothing else, make sure you hit Slash at least once every 8 seconds. And there's certain points where you'll probably be hitting that quite a bit. If you're looking at me, I've got Twin Saber Throw procced, so I can proc that right there. At any part in the fight, like Sorren was talking about, make sure you use Force Clarity. So my Well, it ran out because the combat dummy got reset. Force Clarity you want to use on Mirthless Lash, but frankly, if you aren't getting into the habit of using it Mirthless Lash, just always use it. Don't let it sit there ever. It's just an extra 25% damage on an ability, so even if you happen to use it on Slash, no problem. That's still 25% on top of what is essentially 13k damage, so it's a nice boost regardless. So priority-wise, you want to make sure you always have your dots up when they are available. So Cauterize should always be there. Your Slash will refresh it, along with your Saber. Always hit Merciless Slash whenever it's available. And of course, same goes for Overload and Force Melt. And if you don't have any of those available to use, that's when you hit your Slash, or at least once every 8 seconds. So things like Blade Barrage can kind of filter in when there's a gap. It does a nice chunk of damage, and you don't want to let it just sit there, but it's not necessarily a priority. Your Zealous Strike, that's your focus builder. You just go ahead and use that whenever you need some focus. The one that's off cooldown is Overload Saber. That doesn't actually do any damage itself, but it makes your melee attacks actually do apply the dot to the target, and it stacks to 3 times. Now, that's the single target there. The one thing I'll throw out there is if you've got multiple targets, make sure you've got at least your Force Melt and Cauterize on your target, and then you can hit Force Sweep. I mean, it has less than 6-second cooldown, so it's back up pretty darn quick all the time. And you could literally hit Force Sweep, and then your Twin Saber throw, and then it's going to proc your Cauterize on all those targets, plus refresh it for you, too. So what I recommend doing is at this point, go ahead and just wail on some of the training dummies. Get used to being constantly applying those dots, and then always hitting Merciless Slash. Make sure you're using Force Clarity whenever you have it up. Fill in Blade Barrage when you can. Whenever you get the proc on Twin Saber Throw, go ahead and use that.
I think I would say, just for if you want to get a little bit more in advanced, I guess, is what you can do is as soon as you Force Sleep, you can hit your Overload Saber while you're in the air. So while you're jumping to that target, you can hit your Overload Saber to immediately get that procced. And then, so that's a little bit different than what Brian is doing. Brian's doing it a little bit differently in that he's saving that for a little bit longer. But if what I do is I jump in and immediately use that Overload Saber while I'm in the air, and then I Zealous Strike into a Cauterize, and then my Force Melt, and then my Merciless Lash. So that's what I do. It's a little bit different than what Brian does. It's kind of a personal preference in that way, based off where you want to get that Overload Saber applied. But you can, since it's off the global cooldown, you can get it applied while you're in the air of your Force Sleep. That just kind of saves you a little bit of time in between some of those other abilities. But like we said, it is off the global cooldown, so you can kind of use it whenever you feel like.
It's a great point. Actually, when I was jumping in there, I used the same thing too. It was during the leap, but I know exactly what you mean. So when you can, use it all the time. And the same goes for Zen. As soon as it's up, pop it. The only time you don't want to use Zen immediately is if you see the boss getting relatively low on health, maybe like 30%, because most likely you're going to get called raid buffs at that point, which you can save your setting for the raid buff and then hit Valorous Call and then hit Zen again so that you get your real bang for your buck.
Also, we didn't talk about this. For any 70 content, make sure a good place to use your Fate Sealer is when I use it is after I jump in. I get my Cauterize, I get my Force Melt, and as soon as I do that, then I pop it, use my Merciless Slash, and go into my Blade Barrage and Force Storm. So just make sure you want to use that as early on in the fight as you can, but it's really good to not use that for your dot abilities because you don't really need the extra alacrity on those. You want to save those extra couple seconds for using it on your melee weapon abilities that you can, like your Merciless Lash, your Blade Barrage, your Force Storm, all those things that can hit immediately. You don't really want to use it on your dots that are going to tick over time, if that makes sense.
And it's going to feel weird during your rotations too. Like right now, I think I spammed Slash 3 times in a row because it was the only ability that was up that I needed to use, and it is the best one to use during the when you don't have Blade Barrage up or Mirthless Lash. And Zen is also off the global cooldown too, so don't worry about spending any time on that one. It pops as well.
But a really big thing is you want to make sure it's okay if you have to reapply your cauterize, but you want to make sure that you're keeping it up. It's difficult, especially in raid fights and things where there's a lot of dots on the bosses. But you gotta learn to keep your eye on your cauterize, especially. That's the one you want to keep up at all times because you can with Spiteful Saber. You can't do anything about your force mail. It's just on a cooldown. You got to wait till it comes back up. But your cauterize, you want to keep it on at all times, and if it falls off, you want to immediately reapply it. This is one of your highest damaging abilities. I actually think it is your highest damaging ability. I'd have to look at some parses, but either way, this is one of your big abilities. It does a ton of damage, and it ticks pretty fast. It comes off pretty fast. It's only 9 seconds, and if you get a little bit sidetracked in that rotation, it's going to fall off. You're not going to notice it. If you didn't use a slash or a saber throw, it's gone, and you're just losing out on so much damage. So you really want to make sure you're keeping track. Watch over top of that enemy bar. Make sure that you're keeping track that's not falling off. Like I said, it's not a big deal if you got to reapply it. You don't want to if you don't have to. If it doesn't come down, you had to move or something. It's really good to make sure you're using that slash or twin saber throw to keep it up. But if all else fails, just make sure you're reapplying it, keeping it on there. I mean, the old Watchman Sentinel, you had to reapply it every 9 seconds. It was terrible. I mean, this Spiteful Saber is really, really helpful in that aspect, that you don't have to constantly reuse your cauterize, and that's why it's such... I mean, also ticking that damage is just really, really good. But it doesn't do anything if the dot is falling off. That damage doesn't get ticked. So you want to just make sure at all times you're keeping your cauterize up and using that overload saber and your force melt as often as possible.
And the one key thing with this spec too is just getting used to the spam of it all. And it's not that you have to just constantly spam different abilities, but you want to be able to just chain them. So, don't take a second or two between each ability. Make sure you hit the next one. If you've got the 1 second, what's what I'm looking for? Activation queue, it's the best one, I personally think. That way, if your next ability you're going to use is ready to go, hit that. If it's within 1 second, it's going to pop it right away. It makes your abilities flow a lot smoother then, too. Like I said, it's going to feel weird spamming slash so much, but you'll get used to it.
I got stuck in the thing, the out of mod station over here.
Does anyone have any questions? I know it was a lot of information that we went over. A lot of this is going to require a bit of practice, just getting used to when to use certain things, but it's more a priority system.
The only question I had, Brian, was, and Sorren, you can chime in too. When you read Overload Saber and it talks about causing your next 3 successful melee attacks, I kind of took that as put your 2 dots on, your force melt, your cauterize, and then hit that, and then your merciless slash or twin saber throw would tick. Is that not right?
No, so it just applies.
Gotcha. So you want to hit that first.
Yeah. So any melee attack after that would then just apply one of those dots.
Yeah, that's the big reason why it's good to just use it in the air for sleep, in my opinion. You can just use it in the air, and as soon as you start hitting, you can get that dot applied, and you can get it on cooldown. I mean, it doesn't do it doesn't do increased damage or anything if you use it on a different attack. So, like, if you use it on Merciless Slash, it's not going to do any additional damage or anything like that. So it doesn't matter what ability you use it with. You just want to use it and get it applied. So that way, A, it gets on cooldown, and so it's up faster, and B, you can get it applied as soon as possible and get that damage ticking. It would be great though if you could use it on like Merciless Slash, and it would do additional damage based off the weapon, however much damage the ability did, but that'd be a little bit broken.
Yeah. Well, and that's just kind of how it reads. So that's why I thought that. But yeah, good. Thanks for the answer.
One thing I'll throw out there as I'm thinking about in terms of a tip, there's 3 abilities that I never, ever touch in this spec. One is Leg Slash, unless I'm PvPing. That's the only other exception for that. The Cyclone Slash, completely useless because our Force Sweep is on a 6-second cooldown, is much better. And then Blade Storm. It's just, it doesn't get any bonuses, doesn't help out at all. So frankly, I don't even have that on my list of abilities for my tool. It's a nice one for stunning ads when you're out doing like heroics, something like that. But honestly, because you get no bonuses, it kind of sucks. What was the question about AoE versus single target rotation?
When to use Force Sweep, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can use it whenever you want. Like if I've got 2 or 3 targets, I'm popping the darn thing. I'll focus on one target first to get my melt and cauterize up, and then. And the nice thing is, if the targets are up for long enough, like if there's a flashpoint trash pack or something like that, you applied the melt and cauterize on the first target right away. When you hit Force Sweep, there's about a second or 2 delay on those ads. So the next time you hit Force Sweep, the buffs or the dots are probably going to be off your main target in some cases. Cauterize should still be up, but as soon as you hit Sweep again, it's going to spread from the group of ads to the main target. And the next time you hit Force Sweep, it'll do the same thing back to the ads unless they're dead. And of course, Twin Saber Throw whenever it's procced.
And just to echo Brian's point a little bit about Blade Storm, the big reason why you don't want to use I use Blade Storm occasionally. The reason why I do that is just because it is kind of it's a nice filler ability. But the big reason why you don't want to use it often at all, if ever, like Brian, like he said, he doesn't use it at all. And the big thing I would say is because it uses a lot of focus. 4 focus is a ton of focus to use for an ability that, like Brian said, there's no additional buff you get from anything in the discipline tree. There's no additional, you don't get an extra burn or anything like that. Like, you don't get any extra thing to it. It's just damage. And the damage is about the same as what you're going to get from a slash. And your slash is going to tick that damage. It costs 1 less focus. Like, it's a minimal amount of damage that you're losing out on, like 2K, I guess, ish. But you're saving an additional focus, and you're using your slash, which is with your Spiteful Saber. It's going to do more damage at the end of the day because it's ticking that cauterized damage from your Spiteful Saber. So, at the end of the day, you're going to get more damage from using your slash anyway over Blade Storm. So I'm going to stop using it now that, I've really kind of thought about that some more. It's just kind of, like Brian said, it's not really anything that you're going to get a huge benefit from because you're just using extra force and doing less damage at the end of the day now with Spiteful Saber.
So 1 or 2 of the quick tips just I wanted to throw out there that, these are just things you learn along the way with this class. Things like Rebuke. So one thing about that ability, obviously you have to take damage to actually get it to refresh, but that can literally last 30 seconds and it's got a minute cooldown timer. So you don't want to go stand purposely in damage to get it to tick sometimes, but actually, if your healers don't mind, it may not hurt to just kind of sidestep into something for a second and then come back out. But with Rebuke, for many, many, many fights, there's a lot of AoE damage going out. So if you know one of those fights, pop that. Make sure it's up. It is a nice defensive cooldown, but again, with all those other utilities that you buffed into it, it really does help quite a bit. Don't forget, you've got Saber Ward. You're a Jedi, a Jedi Knight, so you've got that ability just like the Guardians have too. And then the only other thing I wanted to reiterate too was with Awe. That one, you really will not use it all that often, but in some of these fights, it's a great stun. If just to interrupt. Like, I think I used it, we did High Queen last night with the Hardbone group. I used it twice to be able to just do a quick interrupt on something because it didn't have a immune to stun buff. So keep that stuff in mind. You got a lot of defensives. You got a lot of damage that output there too. And then, as always, force camouflage on cooldown. Drop that threat. Yes, cauterize, melt, and overload saber.
And just one more thing, like I said, for raid fights and stuff, you're not going to use Pacify, but for flashpoints and heroics, it is a really helpful ability. It's on a minute-long cooldown, but it reduces the target's melee and ranged accuracy by 90% for 6 seconds, which is really helpful. They basically just miss everything. It does work on, you can use it on ads, you can use it on, heroic bosses, elites, whatever, flashpoints. You can use it in there. So I would recommend using this in those kind of situations. You just can't use it on op bosses. It even says it. So because that would be broken as heck. But you can use this, and it's really a good ability to be using to just reduce some damage that's going to come out. They're just going to start the ads or the elite boss you're fighting, whatever, is going to be missing a lot with a 90% accuracy reduction for 6 seconds. And also, we didn't talk about dispatch because, we didn't get these, we can't kill these targets. So, but once you get the enemy down below 30% health, you do want to start kind of weaving that in there as well. Your Spiteful Saber does work with that, so you can kind of basically, in essence, trade out a slash for a dispatch, because the damage is higher on dispatch by quite a lot, about 6 to 7K. So you do want to kind of, at that point, you want to kind of prioritize your dispatch over your slash, because it's going to take the damage as well, and it does a lot more just base damage. And the cooldown is 9.3 seconds, but you can use that on cooldown once you get somebody below that 30% threshold, and instead of your slash. And that's just, they cost the same focus. So that's just additional damage. Same thing as what slash is doing. It's just going to do a higher amount of damage.
And the other thing to throw out there too is with Transcendence, because if you've hopefully taken that utility, which takes it off of this need for centering, and then, if you have fleet footed, even better. But Time Transcendence, it's a fantastic ability. Not only does it speed things up or potentially cleanse movement debuffs, it's also 10% melee and range defense for everyone. So it's actually a pretty darn good defensive ability too. If you happen to be in a fight where you don't really need to go fast, but some damage spike's going to be coming out, pop that. It helps. So think of yourself as a utility knife as a Sentinel. But don't be a Centard. Don't jump in for the tank. Any questions on anything we've talked about?
Also, please use your raid buff, just as the last thing. Please use it. Please. It is really good. 10% damage and healing is just insane. And if you got a long fight, it is really good to Isaacs or, something that is an incredibly long fight. These are on 4-minute cooldown, or 5-minute cooldown, sorry. You can, if you've got a 6-minute fight, guess what? If you jump in and immediately pop your raid buff, you're going to have it again by the end of the fight. So you can have it for that ending burn phase. It is, and this is one of the ones that is really helpful to do that. I mean, I think it's good to do that with any raid buff, but especially on those long fights, just make sure you can jump in, you can pop it instantly, and you're going to have it for the end.
All right. Well, if we don't have any more questions, I think that's it then too. So go ahead and practice at some point. Just get a feel for the rotation, get used to hitting the abilities when you need. And if you have questions, you're doing this kind of stuff, or you want to practice with someone in a Flashpoint group, say the word. But thanks everyone for coming then too. Hopefully it was some helpful information.
Yeah, appreciate it, guys. It's very, very good.
Thank you.
Yep, real good, man.